Well, here we are again for another riveting edition of Questions with Colin. I am your host, Colin McCormick, Parish Administrator here at St. Francis Xavier, and today our illustrious guest is Father Steve Lantry. You might know him as Father Steve. Steve, welcome.
Thank you, Colin. Good
I'm
to
going
be
to ask
here.
you a series of rapid-fire questions that are not on the list,
Okay.
so people get to know you. What's your middle name?
Charles.
Charles. Favorite color?
Probably blue.
Place of birth?
Spokane.
If you didn't want so much to be here right now in this interview, where would you like to be transported to right now?
Anywhere else.
And with that, we begin our interview with Father Steve Lantry. Today is no ordinary day in the life of Father Lantry as he celebrates 50 years in the Society of Jesus.
That's right. I entered on this date in 1972.
Where were you in 1972?
I was living in Spokane and I was truck driving. I had 2 routes a week, one in Washington and Oregon, and one every week out to Great Falls. And that's how I became acquainted with this area.
So, truck driving,
Yes.
hence your love of driving, period.
That would be an expression of it, yes.
So what, you and I had spoken a few years ago, and I had asked you, well, how were you called to the priesthood? And you said, I wasn't really called. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? It had to do with the truck driving in Great Falls and Missoula.
Well, a lot of people have heard me use the expression slow is real. And I would say that's how God has always operated with me. So, no clear like sound of a bell, I want you to do this. I had been in the Jesuits right after high school, and then they invited me to seek my fortune elsewhere.
So a little premature entry into the society. They said, no, go elsewhere for a time.
Yeah. I like to say, they said they thought I'd be happier elsewhere. They knew they'd be happier if I were elsewhere. So I did a little college, and then I was in the Army for almost 4 years, Eritrea and Vietnam.
Wow.
And then I went back to Spokane after the military and did a little more college, but then I kind of fell into this truck driving job. And the vocation director for the Oregon province was the pastor here, Pat Kenny, Father Pat Kenny. Some people may remember him. Anyway, I'd known him before, and in the winter, I couldn't get back from Great Falls to deliver the backhauls in Mizzou, so I had to stay here overnight. Well, he and I would go to dinner, and one night, out of the blue, we had not been talking about the Jesuits at all. He dropped me at the motel and he said suddenly, you know, I think if you want to, you should re-enter the Jesuits.
And just place that idea out there again?
Yeah, he just dropped that. And so I thought about that for a couple of months. And that would have been the spring of 72. And I did apply. I actually didn't think they'd readmit me, but I guess they were pretty desperate for numbers.
So you re-entered.
Yes.
They were happy to see you a second time.
At least they pretended to be.
But this time you made it stick, went through passing with flying colors. And when were you actually ordained?
I was ordained June 13th, 1981 at St. James Cathedral by Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen, which has been, I think, an enormous grace in my life.
Tremendous. Now, since 1981, what have been your primary roles as a priest? Because unlike diocesan priests, who are pretty much tied to a parish consistently,
right,
Jesuits can teach, they can be in parishes, they can be administrative, they can be on mission. What sort of assignments did you have over the years?
Okay, so After theology in '82, I was sent to Spokane to the high school, which
Oh.
is actually the one I attended, Gonzaga Prep. And I was there for 6 years, mostly teaching English, doing retreats. My favorite course of teaching was a religion elective for seniors called Literature and Spirituality.
Ah,
And as my grandmother would have said, in that course I had more fun than people. So 6 years there, and then John Fuchs was the novice director, and with the permission of the provincial, he invited me to be his assistant.
okay.
So I went to Portland in '88, and I was there for 6 years. The last year and a half was with Father Pat Lee. He became novice director. And then I had the permission of the provincial to do a marriage and family therapy degree at Seattle Pacific, which I did '94 to '96. And then I was asked, I had other plans, but I was asked to go to Gonzaga in Spokane, the university, to work in the counseling center and to be a priest in residence at the philosophy. So these are guys just out of the novitiate who are studying,
Yeah.
doing first studies. So I was there for 7 years.
Wow.
And then, from my point of view, completely out of the blue, because I had no experience, the provincial, John Whitney, asked me to go to St. Leo in Tacoma. And I went there in '03, and I thought I'd be there 5 or 6 years. I was there for 15 years.
So, right into a major urban parish, and you kind of a baptism by fire.
Yeah. But the thing is, if I succeeded there, it's only because of the other people on staff who were just extraordinarily gifted in so many ways, and who all had a really rich interior life themselves. Yeah, I would have failed if I'd been mostly on my own, but they taught me everything I needed to know. And then the community, that would be the most extraordinary experience I've had in the society. Nothing against St. Francis or any other parish, but that was my first experience.
Right.
And it was exceptional.
I was going to ask you of all your assignments, what was the most meaningful to you? And it sounds like that was pretty formative for you.
Yeah, the operative word there is most meaningful. Everything I've done in society has been meaningful, but it was just the spirit of that community. And yeah, as I said to them at the gathering before I left there, I'm a much better human being for having been here.
Wow, that's quite a compliment,
Yeah.
actually, to pay to your staff and to the parish.
Yeah, remarkable place.
Yeah.
I would say this, the best internal job in the Jesuits I've ever had was vocation director, and I did that from 1998 to 2010.
To 2010. Okay, so that's a good segue, because I wanted to ask you, you are also the superior of the Rivali community. And, a lot of people, a lot of our own parishioners don't understand that there is this role called superior in each of the communities. Can you educate everyone a little bit about what the role of the superior is?
Okay. The local superior in a Jesuit community is, let's say, the go-between between the provincial superior and the local Jesuits. It's a very strong custom in the Jesuits. Now, some Jesuits do live alone on their own, but they're always attached to some community.
Some community, right.
There's always a superior to whom they can talk about their life and their work. According to documents in the Jesuits, the main job of the superior is cura personalis, that is, care of the personnel, literally. So it's to care for people, to pay attention to how they're doing, not just in the work, in their ministry, but, in their day-to-day lives, to kind of facilitate things, to gather us for spiritual conversation. I'd say that's the major responsibility. But because we're such a small group, namely 6 people with Father Lankenau. He's in Stevensville, in Hamilton.
Yeah.
But he's attached to our community. The Latin expression for those who want it is extra domum, outside the house. So it's such a small group. I really function as the minister also, which is, looking after the practical things, maintaining the house and things like that.
So, superior or vocations director? Which one do you prefer?
Oh, hands down. I love being the vocation director, yeah.
And you're critical and pivotal to those men at that period in their lives when they're really doing an awful lot of discernment.
At that time, now the way that ministry is conducted has really changed. But at the time, my main job was to meet guys and to listen to their stories, their vocation stories. It was such a privilege, and the stories were so different.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, not everyone is called the same way, and I think that part of what's prompted me to have these conversations with our priests and other folks, but mainly the priests, is finding out how is it that we're called, how all the different ways that each one of you have been called to the priesthood. It's often not a thunderbolt, a parting of the clouds, and a deep baritone voice.
No, I don't know who's had that experience. At the heart of the faith is the Incarnation. Absolutely at the heart of the faith. Ignatius' spirituality is very incarnational. God's action, the action of the Spirit in our lives is mediated, and that's mostly through other people, but it's through things and places like Missoula as opposed to somewhere else, through nature. So grace is mostly mediated. Even Aquinas said grace builds on nature.
Well, you alluded earlier to teaching at Gonzaga and the literature course?
Literature and spirituality.
Literature and spirituality. So it's known among all of us here at St. Francis, your great love of poetry. And when did that begin in your life, this great love of poetry?
It began in the summer of 1984.
Really? So rather later on. It wasn't something instilled in childhood or high school so much.
Not a bit.
Interesting.
In fact, even though my bachelor's degree was in English literature, I really, let's say I cordially loathed poetry because I was operating under the impression that it was designed by the poets themselves to be impenetrable, to be obscure.
Yeah.
Like, guess what I mean? But
which I think stops a lot of people from really enjoying poetry, because oftentimes they can't get past the deep analogies and the
density of the language.
Yes, and the density of the language.
So I like to quote Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He's the one who said, "Prose is the best words in good order, but poetry is the best words in the best order." So, I won't go into the details. It's too long a story, but I bought a couple of volumes in the summer of '84. One of them was Selected Poems of W.H. Auden. It took me about 8 months to read that book. To go through it.
Right.
Andre, I still have that original paperback copy. The spine is broken, it's coming apart, but I can still quote some lines from that. And what it did is it did two things. First of all, it fired my imagination, and secondly, it opened the door to affect, that is, to feeling. And we tend to, especially in the Jesuits, we tend to rely too much on our brains. So Ignatius was big.
Well, they are very large brains.
And pretty distorted sometimes, too, I might add.
Well, poetry, the use of poetry, What is it about poetry, from your opinion, that lends itself so well to being incorporated into homilies? Because I think sometimes you have, it's almost the perfect quote for a poem that just seems to lend itself so well to the readings and to the homilies. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about poetry as a medium, especially when it comes to homilies.
Yes. Well, the first thing is that a person has to love language. And I think love it in a playful way.
Mm-hmm.
A second element would be that I think most people don't realize this, and I don't know Hebrew, but much of the Hebrew scriptures is in the form of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Much of it. I mean, the Psalms.
The Psalms alone.
Are all poetry. Huge sections of Isaiah
Mm-hmm.
are nothing but poetry. The Song of Songs, which one rabbi said all the scriptural books are holy, but the holiest of them is the Song of Songs. And that's love poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So a good line of poetry, or a good couple of lines with usually a single image, can capture the essence of a whole passage of scripture. So that's why when I've given these readings, I always title them Praying with Poetry. Because that's really the idea, is to sit with it in a prayerful way. I mean, you can pray the Our Father, you can pray the Rosary,
Sure.
or you can sit with a volume of poems, but they all have the capacity to open the affect to whatever's happening in a person's life.
So we know you're a great lover of poetry. We know that you enjoy the occasional cigar,
I do.
but you are also known to keep a tidy yard. You have been spotted edging the sidewalks here at St. Francis. What is with this compulsion to keep things neat and orderly in the garden?
Well, it's perfect that you should ask. I just stumbled on this quote from Merton, who I think was referring to this poem by Rumi. It's easy to get stuck in our heads, and a lot of our work is prepared there and then done out of there. But doing some physical labor engages the body in a way that mental work never does.
Oh, absolutely.
And somehow it relaxes the mind. I don't know if these lines will mean anything to people, but in a recent Rumi poem I prayed with, he said, "The mind is a husk, and the appetites love coverings. They look for them everywhere." Physical work is a way of stripping off the coverings for the less healthy parts of our personalities. It's downtime for the mind, and it kind of gives the spirit some rest also.
It's funny how you have to have your body occupied physically some way,
Yes.
doing work in order to kind of free your mind at times to get on to other things or to think of things. And the amazing things that pop into your head
Yes.
while you're doing the most mundane things like...
To use that expression, free your mind,
Yeah.
it's better to do some physical work than to take a pill,
Yeah, certainly.
whether it's green or red.
So here we are, 50 years on in the Society of Jesus. So, big questions. Looking back now, what have you found to be the most challenging aspect of having been in the Society for 50 years and priest for 40 some years?
The most challenging
Yeah.
aspect.
In 5 words or less.
Can't do it. Can't. Next question.
No, go ahead.
I think the most challenging aspect of life in the Society of Jesus is the most challenging aspect of life in any particular group, whether it's a family or a business or a social group, and that is my own and the human failings of other people. It's dealing with our brokenness, our weakness. I think by far and away that's the most challenging thing. And if I wanted to characterize that in stronger terms, I would say it's the experience of betrayal. And even though those are terribly unpleasant for everyone, nevertheless, somehow I think we need those experiences in our lives. This would be a much longer conversation, but yeah,
Part two.
I would say that's the challenging part.
And what would you say, looking back, has been the most life-giving? What has been maybe the greatest grace in your experience?
I would say friendship.
Friendships.
Yeah, or a more religious term might be brotherhood, but I would say friendship. My closest friends are Jesuits or ex-Jesuits, and it's always a delight to be with them, even though I don't get to see them all that often.
Right.
Yeah, that's the greatest, because, even though I'm an introvert, nobody does this alone.
Right.
And again, to go back to the incarnational thing, we all need someone to talk to about our experience and to share the journey with.
So what does 1972 Steve say to 2022 Steve?
He hasn't got much to say. 1972 Steve doesn't, well, he was quite clueless. Let's put it that way. Yeah, he had, I still have a lot to learn, but he hadn't even started learning the important things.
So he doesn't have anything to say to you. But it sounds like you had something to say to 1972 Steve from 2022 Steve.
Well, to put it quite tersely, if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here.
Absolutely.
So there's some continuity.
You have been here at St. Francis since 2018 or 19?
February 10th, 2019.
Of 19, yeah. And it's been a smooth ride.
Oh, yeah.
It's filled with joyful ups and downs.
As the Germans say, Stück Torte. It's been a piece of cake.
It's been a piece of cake.
Yeah.
Anyway, we have certainly have been blessed by your presence here, and hope we have you for many, many more moons, as they say, whatever the society decides, I suppose. I have one last question for you, shamelessly stealing from another host, and James Lipton, Actor Studio.
Oh my gosh, you don't have any blue cards, though.
I don't have any blue cards. I have to pick up my game a little bit. But I've always liked this question that he asked, and so I'll pose it to you as well. So, you have left this earth, you have shed the mortal coil, and what does Jesus say to you?
Well, like the Zen master said, 100% don't know.
Don't know.
No, but
what would you like Jesus to say to you?
Yeah, well, let me place it in the context of my favorite religious legend. And that is, there's a poem called The Harrowing of Hell. And, it's about Jesus descending to the dead, to use the language of the creed. And my favorite legend says the first person he goes in search of is Judas. Yeah. So I think welcome, and a hug. That's what I would expect. Yeah.
We should all be so lucky to be welcomed and to be hugged.
Yeah.
Father Steve, I've enjoyed this interview. I know you have. Since you wished you could have been zapped away to any place other than this interview.
Here I am living the dream.
No, but we appreciate it, and we congratulate Father Steve Lantry on 50 years in the Society of Jesus. Many more, and thank you.
I've always heard that the first 50 are the hardest.